Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And sorry about the delay there. Since I've last used StreamYard, it doesn't seem to want to accept PowerPoints. We had to fiddle around to make a workable version. But we're back. Did you miss me? I'm sorry I was away. I had the conference in San Diego and I had a week-long Normandy tour. But anyway, welcome back to the channel. If you are new and you've discovered this in the last 3 weeks where we haven't been doing any new content, welcome to the channel. Please don't forget to subscribe. Click the little bell so you receive notifications, and all the information you always need is in the description below. You'll find links to my guests' books, their websites, their social media accounts, and you'll find out how to buy World War II TV merchandising. And if you would consider becoming a patron, it is always greatly appreciated. So our guest today is Colonel Retired Mark Vlahos, who is here to talk about troop carrier operations in the Mediterranean. Good afternoon, Mark. How are you today?
Hey, doing great, Paul. Thanks for having me this week.
Thank you. And that was a bit of a hairy few minutes trying to get PowerPoint to work, but we're up and running now. So that's great. So I've seen you on a couple of other podcasts. I've seen you talking about this subject. And in airborne in World War II is the thing that everybody's interested in. It's the paratroopers. The people love Normandy. They love Sicily. But the people who flew them into action seem to get a little bit less attention. So my first question before we bring up your presentation is why do you think Troop Carrier Command is less well known than the men who jump out of the aircraft?
That's a great question, Paul, and I'd love to address it. Well, it wasn't a sexy mission. Think about it. The fighters, fighter command, the bombers, they got all the coverage. People want to hear that. And like you said, they want to hear about the paratroopers in their fight. But they would have never got there if it wasn't for the C-47 Dakota crews and the gliders took them to battle.
Brilliant. Well, that's what we're going to hear to talk about. So the Mediterranean is one of the theaters that, if we're talking about a less talked about branch than Troop Carrier Command, then probably the least talked about theater is probably the Mediterranean. People talk about the Normandy, the ETO, they talk about the Pacific, but the Mediterranean, I think it's because it's a complicated one to understand. I think there's the naval aspect, there's the air aspect, there's the ground aspect, lots of countries involved, lots of logistics, and I think people find it a little bit difficult to get their heads wrapped around. But we should remind people that you're going to be coming back on the channel next month for a deeper dive into Operation Husky. But what you're going to do today is you're going to run us through kind of the broad sweeping operations in the Mediterranean. So you've got your PowerPoint up and running, thankfully, after some trial and tribulation. So folks, we'll do questions as we go along today. So if you've got questions for Mark, please fire away and I'll put them up on the screen. But basically, over to you and let's take us through troop carrier operations.
Roger that, Paul. I got it. And you gave me a great transition point. Everybody's familiar with the European theater of operations, the major paratroop operations. But people need to remember this. The United States Army Air Force troop carrier crews and glider pilots cut their teeth in the Mediterranean. And that's our focus today. I'm going to give a broad brush of operations, about 2 years worth, to give everybody a baseline of knowledge that will hopefully help folks out later in the week. But again, it was the tactics, techniques, and procedures that were developed in the Mediterranean were the reasons why Normandy, Holland, those were successful. The Rhine crossing were successful airborne operations. So, but these lessons were learned in blood in the Mediterranean. That's what we're going to talk about today. I think everybody's familiar with the C-47 Skytrain. It was a great aircraft. It was the mainstay of the American troop carrier forces. That it was based on the Douglas Aircraft Corporation, the civilian DC-3. And also there's a variant called the C-53, which was almost identical to the C-47, just a couple minor differences. But this was the mainstay. There's a picture of a C-47 getting refueled in North Africa. And just a couple data points on the C-47, its payload, about 2.5 to 3 tons, 14 to 18 paratroopers per minute, per load, I'm sorry. And the heaviest weapon it could carry was the 75 millimeter pack howitzer, which was the mainstay of the airborne forces too. It could land on a dirt strip less than 3,000 feet, had a maximum range of about 1,500 miles with extra fuel tanks. Normal cruise speed was 150 miles per hour. It would slow down to 110 miles per hour for paratroop drops. Let's talk about the glider pilots. In the Army Air Forces, the glider pilots were assigned to the troop carrier squadrons of the troop carrier groups, not to the Army Airborne Division. So that was a misconception for a lot of folks. And the The glider pilot wings had a G on them, and I call those kind of like the G stood for guts.
Yeah,
I'll tell you
before.
Crazy mission. Theirs was a far more dangerous mission once they cut away from their tow aircraft. And I'll just tell you, just learning about the glider pilots is just amazing. There's a picture of the Waco glider, the CG-4A, which was the mainstay of the American glider forces. And it's pronounced Waco for the Weaver Aircraft Company that made it. I live in Texas. Folks want to say Waco. Most folks do, but it's actually pronounced Waco. It was the Waco was about 84 feet long, and it was mainly covered by fabric made out of aluminum tubing and wood. So it was a very light and maneuverable aircraft. The square fuselage made it easy for cargo loading. And there's a picture of this is a very neat photo I stumbled across from a private collection from the grandson of a glider pilot. That is the first Waco glider that was assembled and flown, made it into North Africa. So that's a very historic picture right there, taken in Algeria by the guys who flew it there.
And just a quick question, because we haven't addressed the fact that, you've got a distinguished career behind yourself in the more modern era with regards transport and the kind of roles that were being asked of these people back in World War II. But when you look back as a professional, everything that the Allies were using in World War II, especially 42, it wasn't specifically designed for the job. I mean, the gliders were, I suppose, but the C-47 wasn't. It was something the Allies used, as a lot of the technology, the landing craft that were developed out of things coming out of New Orleans for other purposes. Are you amazed at how much innovation there was and how the Allies were good at taking equipment that wasn't actually designed for a purpose and making such good use of it?
Yeah, that's a great point to make there, Paul. Think about it. The C-47 was based on the DC-3. It was a passenger aircraft. Yeah. When that plane came out, the airborne mission didn't exist in America. It didn't exist in our Army till 1941. We played catch up. And then, as you said, we had to adapt, adjust, and overcome, as us modern military folks like to say, with what we had on hand, to off the shelf to make do. So we had to adapt to the paratrooper mission, and the glider tow mission on the fly, on the go. So, and this picture here, there's a picture of a C-47 towing a CG-4A, and that picture was taken in North Africa also. That's just on a training flight prior to the build-up to Operation Husky. Okay. Let's talk about a little bit about the 51st Troop Carrier Wing. And this is one of my favorite wings. There are actually 3 groups in that wing, and a troop carrier group was comprised of 4 troop carrier squadrons. So you had about 13 aircraft in each squadron, about 52 aircraft in an entire group. So they're in a wing. So folks know you're talking about 150 to 152 aircraft, just to get you the size and the scope. And that's the composite of the 51st Wing, which was the first wing to deploy to Europe. They just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, those 3 troop carrier groups made their way to England as part of Operation Bolero. So they were the first C-47 groups to deploy to Europe. The 60th, leading the way, was the first. So near and dear to my heart, the 60th Troop Carrier Group. So a string of first tiers, you're going to see me talk about that throughout my briefing. Once in England, the 60th Troop Carrier Group trained extensively with the 1st Paratroop Battalion, U.S. Paratroop Battalion, that also made its way over England. And that was the 2nd of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Battalion at the time. And what was interesting is the day they left on Operation Torch, which I'll talk about briefly soon here, they were redesignated as the 2nd to the 509th. So the 503rd initially in England became the 509th, which stayed in the Mediterranean throughout the war. And those 2 pictures are original photos from the 60th Troop Carrier Group training with the 503rd in England there. There's their cat patch, as I call it. That's the original patch of the 2nd to the 503rd.
And Mark, we've just got a question going back to gliders. It can take a minute or 2 for the questions to come in. Richard is asking, were the gliders transported across the Atlantic by cargo ship and then fully assembled when on dry land? That
is correct. They were the U.S. Wacos where it took 5 crates. They were broken up into 5 crates to make one complete glider. They were transported by ship and then reassembled in North Africa and later in England. That's correct.
Good. And we have another, while we're doing questions, Scott Grimwood is asking, and I think this is good, worth clearing up, because I had Adam Berry on the channel back in the early days of World War II TV, and we're talking about the pilots of the troop carriers and how perhaps they're not perceived as being the best trained, and that they were kind of the ones who are at the bottom of the class there. As someone with your background, do you want to address that? Because it's one of those things that gets repeated. Stephen Ambrose, my least favorite historian, was always repeating this idea that the troop carrier pilots were the worst of the worst. What's your comment on that?
Oh, yeah, I would take personal exception in debate. By the way, a data point, Mr. Ambrose did not interview one troop carrier pilot, not one single one, and there were still over 1,000 of them alive when he published his mainstay book there on D-Day operations. But think about this. Prior to D-Day, all these troop carrier groups that participated, that went under the Mediterranean, and 5 of those groups, an entire wing, went back to England for the D-Day buildup. They had thousands of hours. Each crew member had 1,000 hours of experience before D-Day. So from the 52nd Troop Carrier Wing, those groups that went back. So I take exception to that. They were not the bottom of the class. It was just a different mission. It wasn't a sexy mission, as I mentioned earlier. Fighter bombers.
We addressed at the beginning the fact it's the least popular subject, and when I'm going down a World War II TV rabbit hole. So, folks, you can have a drink, because I've said rabbit hole nice and early today. But your point about the fact that Ambrose, and it's not just Ambrose, other historians as well, spoke to the paratroopers but didn't speak to the guys who were delivering the paratroopers, I think is very, very pertinent, because the guys in the back of an aircraft don't necessarily understand the difficulties the pilot is facing. They don't understand the fact that their own loads, if they're each carrying 30 or 40 pounds more gear, that's affecting what the aircraft can do, and there's the speeds and things like that. So I think the only way to understand this sort of aspect is to speak to all the people involved. So ground crews, people flying the aircraft, people jumping out of the aircraft, and people planning the whole thing. And then maybe you'd get a good understanding of the difficulties and how well done. I always make the point about normally, then we'll turn it back to the ETO, is I think 5 out of 6 of the Parachute Infantry Regiment commanders wrote congratulatory letters to the troop carrier commands after June the 6th, saying, all things considered, fantastic job getting us to the right place. So that is something that Ambrose and others didn't repeat. But we're going down a rabbit hole talking about Normandy, because it's my thing. But back to you. I'm glad we've addressed the idea that the pilots are not these third grade people that sometimes is repeated. In
one other data point, the commanders of the troop carrier groups, most of them were airline pilots, reservists before World War II. They were flying the DC-3. They had thousands of hours before they were recalled back into service, the American pilots for World War II. Another data point right there.
Super.
Okay, moving along here. Let's set the stage now for North Africa and Operation Torch, the Casablanca Conference, January 14th through 24th, 1943. And it was at this conference that President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, they kind of coordinated on a strategy for how to fight the war. And that's what we decided. The work of the conference was primarily military, and decided on the invasion of Sicily after the completion of the North Africa campaign, which was going on. So that was the major decision out of this, was how to attack the underbelly of Nazi-held Europe. And they decided the decision was made to go up through the soft underbelly, as Winston Churchill, to coin a phrase from him, up through Sicily, through Italy. And that was the Casablanca Conference. Just a little history there. Okay, Operation Torch. Obviously, most folks are aware of that. It was the invasion of North Africa. There were primarily 3 major forces that were set up. And the Western Task Force was under Major George Patton. That was an American task force. They actually sailed from the U.S., that convoy there, 35,000 troops in the U.S. Navy Task Force, directly from the U.S. They were aimed for Casablanca there. The Center Force, which was consisted of 39,000 U.S. troops under Major General Lloyd R. Friedenau. These were escorted by a British naval task force. Obviously, they were their objective was the port of Oran. And then we're going to talk about those 2 airfields just south of Oran there real soon here when I talk about the paratroop mission in the 60th Troop Carrier Group. The Eastern Task Force was all British there. They were mainly pointed at Algiers, just try to orient everybody on a map there. Any other comments on this?
No, we're good.
Okay. Let's talk about that first paratroop mission. And so it was on the paratroop task force. And so 39 C-47s of the 60th Troop Carrier Group were pre-positioned at the furthest southern point in England that they could get to. If you look at that little brown map on the left side of the slide, it's kind of dark, but you can kind of see up at the top there where they departed from, and they overflew off the coast of France, overflew Spain, and their target was basically for Iran there in the center of Algeria. That was a nighttime mission, and you can see that was at the maximum range also of I mentioned the range of 1,500 miles on the C-47. They actually bolted 2 50-gallon gas tanks in the back of each aircraft. Another talking about innovation there to extend the range. There's another data point there in innovation. This was a one-way ticket. You can see whether they dropped paratroopers or the original plan was to air land, hoping the French wouldn't fight back, but that got obviously went snafu there. It was a one-way ticket. These aircraft had to land somewhere with those paratroopers once they overflew Spain. The picture on the right there is kind of a blow up of the objective area. And I mentioned there were 2 airfields just south of the port city of Oran there. You can see La Seigne there. And then if I can't pronounce it right, Tafarui. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Somebody correct me, please. If there was a DZ selected between there, and if there was a battle, there were 2 plans. So when the planes took off, they were, quote, under the peace plan, thinking that the French were not going to fight back. So the paratroopers, the plan was for the aircraft basically to land at these airfields and let off the paratroopers. Well, as we say in the modern military, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So guess what? It didn't go right. The first C-47s, after flying over all night, the formation got broken up. Obviously, this was the first trying to fly night formation for these air crews. Not every plane had a navigator. There was a host of things that went wrong. The winds were 30 miles from crosswind. They got blown off course. 4 of the aircraft landed in French Morocco. The planes were interned, the paratroopers interned in the crews. But the planes that went on, the first, as daylight broke and they started to land, they were fired upon. So all of a sudden, oh my God, they're fired upon. So those planes, remember, I mentioned they were running out of fuel. They had to do something, adapt, adjust, and overcome. So many of the planes, they started landing that big dry lake bed there. See the Sepra de Oran there. That was a dry lake bed where the planes just decided, well, we just got to land here and we'll figure out what we're going to do, because you got to remember the amphibious forces were coming ashore also at the same time. So it's a fluid situation. There's fighting going on. It was just crazy, as you can imagine. Put yourself in their shoes. So then 10 of the aircraft re-rigged. They decided about 12 of the aircraft were landed on the dry lake bed at this time. 10 of the aircraft, the parachute task force commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ed Raff, commander of the paratroops, not the entire force package, but paratroop commander, decided, hey, I'm going to re-rig my guys and we're going to jump in. We're going to jump over, because some of the C-47s that landed on that dry lake bed were surrounded by French forces and they were under attack. So, and hence the first airborne combat airdrop in Army airborne history there. 10 of the aircraft dropped their paratroopers, with Ed Raff included, right there on the dry lake bed. And then after they dropped the paratroopers, these planes had to land too on the lake bed. So about 25 aircraft recovered on this dry lake bed. So that's where we're at. And right about this time, everything was going crazy. They were able to link up with ground forces to try to keep things moving here this morning. So,
and Mark, who was involved? Who was the senior voice in terms of deciding flight paths and drop zones and things? Because when we get to things like Market Garden, there's big debates about whether or not the airborne commanders are in control of it. Do the troop carrier commands have who had the say in this? Because it's still, as we said earlier, it's still in the infancy of all this. And we know through other shows about North Africa, there's all sorts of problems with fighter interdiction. Who's in, the ground want this, the air say that. Who's in charge of this?
Yeah, at this point, like you mentioned, they threw together a planning cell back in England. It was comprised of basically the S3, the operations shop from the troop carrier groups. the three shops from that 503rd Parachute Infantry Battalion, and under Colonel Stephen Bentley was the Parachute Task Force commander. He was an Army Air Force colonel. So it was his planning cell. They did it themselves. They didn't have a staff to oversee this, and help them. So it was done, like you said, on the fly by just the units that actually flew this mission, picked the drop zones, made the plan up.
Right. Thanks.
You got it. There's a neat picture. There's a picture of some of the paratroopers, and there's one stick in the back of a C-47. Those are actually 503rd guys. Original picture there. And you can barely make out, if you see the jump master sitting in the center there by the door of the cockpit. If you look on each side of them, you can see those two barrels laying sideways. Those are those 50-gallon gas cans that they bolted down to the floor there. So that's actually a stick right there. I mentioned that dry lake bed in the fluid situation. These are actual and rare photographs of some of the C-47s on that dry lake bed. And once they linked up with ground forces, and the ground forces actually took control of the airfields, that they were supposed to take. The aircraft were told to take off again and land at those aircraft. Well, 3 of the aircraft picked up some of the paratroopers that actually jumped, and they were going to pick them up to fly them back to land at the airfield. Well, at this time, some French fighter aircraft actually attacked these 3 C-47s loaded with paratroopers. And luck ran out. Up to this point, there were no casualties, but 3 of those C-47s were shot down, forced down, I should say. The pilots did a forced landing on the dry lake bed, and there's an original picture of those 3 aircraft there up top, pictures of the bottom there. The first paratroopers and the first casualties killed in action troop carrier command were killed, two casualties. Paratroopers lost about 10 at this point in the operation right there. So there's still French aircraft flying. It's a fluid situation. What a mess. No plane survives first contact with the enemy. Okay, we got through Operation Torch, basically, and that was the first combat parachute drop. The 60th did that. This slide kind of summarizes, I'm trying to roll up more, the major airborne missions flown as the North African campaign. You can kind of see the C-47s were critical to moving as the armies moved across Algeria into Tunisia, pushing the Germans back into Tunisia. The C-47s, at this time, there was the British 1st Airborne was involved there too, into North Africa. So there's both British, actually more British pairs in North Africa at this time than American. And so the US C-47s were actually dropping the British also at those locations. So several paradrops in the North Africa campaign that people might not be familiar with, as we pushed the Germans into Tunisia, setting the stage for Operation.
And I assume there are others that were proposed and then not happened. I mean, these are the ones that happened, but with the situation being fluid, I'm assuming that there are ideas coming in. We may have to do a jump here, and then it gets scrubbed because ground forces overtake the location. I'm assuming that was the case.
Exactly. Yeah, there sure was. Every day was something new, as you know, that it was reactionary to the needs of what was going on in the battlefield. So there's just good roll-up summary there. I want to mention another mission, the C-47s, another first, medical evacuation missions in the North Africa campaign. Another one of those missions that, the teeth was cut in North Africa. The C-47 proved invaluable, flying casualties back. This is a photo there of I believe a 62nd or 64th 62nd Troop Carrier Squadron group aircraft unloading casualties there. Both British and American casualties were flown back from the front. Another great mission for the C-47. I think I have another photo. Yeah, if you look inside, why the C-47, how it was re-rigged, you can kind of see how they rigged the litter stanchions up there, about 4 or 5 tall. They could carry up to 24 litter patients, usually with a medical team, 1 flight nurse and 2 medical techs tending to the men as they were flown. So that's just another adapt and innovation point right there about how the C-47 was used in the North Africa campaign. And here's a great data point too. You keep mentioning Normandy, Paul. After D-Day, over 26,000 casualties were flown off makeshift landing zones just inland from the beaches there. Makeshift landing zones that the engineers cut behind the beach. 26,000 casualties flown back from France to England after D-Day as the armies were fighting through the hedge flows. So neat. C-47.
Just a question about the medical evacuation. I mean, it's came up on the channel before. When you're talking about North Africa, I forget which historians have said this, but because the command there was further away from London, further away from Washington, D.C., there was a little bit more of a, ability to get things done without having to consult the big bosses. Whereas when you get to things going on in England, there's always these staff officers there arriving in staff cars from all the places in London. Do you think North Africa, therefore, was kind of the best place to set these things up because there was more initiative at a kind of a, not junior command, but that kind of colonel, one-star general kind of level that was a benefit of the North Africa campaign being kind of not forgotten by the powers that be, but kind of there's a lot going on. If you're in London in 42, 43, you're thinking about the Battle of the Atlantic, you're thinking about the combined bomber offensive. Do you think the fact they weren't being inspected all the time benefited this kind of initiative?
Exactly. What a place to develop techniques, and procedures. Who knows better than the guy on the line there, at the tip of the spear to do that. Having served a tour in the Pentagon myself, I'm very aware of bureaucracy and of those staff officers, those damn staff officers, and who were wishing they were there, in the fight instead of on the staff.
Yeah, it seems to me the North Africa campaign is that kind of situation where you, rather than asking permission, you do it and ask forgiveness afterwards. It's kind of that's a situation there. You just get it done and ask permission, post event. Whereas other theaters, you have to get the permission in advance, although you can't get off the ground. Pun intended.
You're right. It's easier to ask forgiveness afterwards than permission beforehand.
No, Brian, this is exactly what we want on the channel. This kind of innovation and the fact that we're already going some considerable way to kind of balancing this idea that Troop Carrier Command was a unit of failures. And again, I'm just quoting other historians on this. I'm not saying my opinion, but it's great work, Mark. Thank you very much.
Sure. And there's another first right there, that medical evacuation mission that is still in the U.S. military as a primary mission today. Carries on to today. This is just a neat photo. This is at Maison Blanche Airfield in Algeria. There's some C-47s on the ground there. That was one of the forward airfields. Just a great original photo I found in the National Archives. We talked about how the Battle of North Africa, they pushed the Germans into Tunisia, cornered them, and then this set the stage for the invasion of Sicily. And I know in July you're going to have a whole week on Operation Husky, so I'm not going to get too deep into it. But talk about the 51st Troop Carrier Wing that flew Operation Husky. And by this time, another American Troop Carrier Wing, the 52nd, which another 5 troop carrier groups, was in North Africa also, used for the invasion of Sicily. So there were about 226 U.S. C-47s that were available for the invasion of Sicily later. This slide here depicts the missions of the 51st Troop Carrier Wing, because these were a combination, and the 51st was a portion to the British sector under General Montgomery. The 52nd Troop Carrier Wing was a portion to General Patton's, the American sector, during the invasion, and they did all paradrops with the 82nd Airborne. I just want to make that clear right there. So again, invasion of Sicily, huge airborne missions, operations, and then we'll talk about that first glider tow mission too, which I'm going to talk about here briefly also. The British 1st Airborne Division, 1st Air Landing Brigade. Okay, this is a picture here of, I mentioned the British 1st Air Landing Brigade there. It's actually loading a Jeep and an American Waco glider. The question earlier, how did those gliders get there by ship? It was a race against time to get enough gliders into North Africa for the invasion of Sicily. That's a whole nother story in itself. The British actually managed to get about 27 horses or so to North Africa prior to the invasion through Operation Begar, it was called, I believe, and just a whole nother. But it was a race against time to get gliders even to North Africa. Speaking of logistics and planning, there's a whole nother problem set right there trying to stage. So Operation, that first British airborne mission the Ladbroke was the code name for the mission. Let's talk about that. The 60th and 62nd Troop Carrier Groups were portioned to the British for that first glider tow mission, combat glider tow mission, about 144 gliders total, mainly towed by the American Troop Carrier Groups, but also RAF. By this time, RAF 38 Wing was in North Africa with their bomber aircraft. At this time, the British were towing the gliders with bomber aircraft. They didn't have a whole force of Dakotas built up yet. So they were also involved with Operation Ladbroke as well. There, you can see there another just Operation Husky photo there. Those are actually American. That's the 82nd Airborne. So you can see that was probably from the 52nd Troop Carrier Wing there. Those Americans filling out forms prior to takeoff for their drop into Italy. This is a kind of a hard chart to see, but the Ladbroke mission, you kind of see to help get you oriented here. That's Tunisia on the left third of the chart there, the coastline of Tunisia. You can see there on the top right center portion there, there's the boot of the corner of Sicily there, and you can see Malta there, kind of where all those lines converge. You can kind of see it was about like a 3.5 hour flight to tow these gliders up over to the objective area release point, turn around and come back to Tunisia. So, a little over 6 hours of flying total. So quite an ambitious undertaking in itself, just to plan this first glider tow. And you think about this, the American Troop Carrier pilots, when they left the States, they had never towed a glider. So the first time they towed a glider was training in North Africa for them. The British glider pilots trained in England. There weren't Waco gliders in England for them to train on, so they had to learn how to fly the American gliders because the majority were American gliders in this operation. But think of all the hectic trying to just prep for this. They're barely trained troops and glider pilots in the glider tow mission. This is a whole new mission. It's complicated, folks. Different formations flown in a paradrop, different parameters. There's just so much. A glider mission is a complicated mission to fly in itself. And young troop carrier crews, but obviously a lot of things didn't go well on the Ladbroke mission. I'll cover in detail some of it, but let's talk about the objective area for the glider tow. This is kind of blow up. There's Syracuse, Italy there. You can see the Ponte Grande bridge there. Is just, if you follow that highway out of Syracuse, you can kind of see the little canal there and the bridge. That was the objective area for the 1st British Airborne Division in this operation. You can see where the LZs were there right off the coast. And I'll just tell you, the LZs picked were too small. They were in poor locations. There's just a lot of planning factors that didn't go wrong. But when I talk about what actually happened, the mission turned into a disaster for a lot of reasons. I'll get into those shortly. But just the planning involved with this, it was difficult. Let's go on.
I'm glad you made that point, Mark, because we'll do the whole Operation Husky 2 weeks in July, but I think there's a perception that everything that happens in Husky is just a stepping stone from Tunisia and North Africa, and all the same units just go straight leaping across, and it's a continuation. And to some extent, that's true in that Montgomery's 8th Army kind of leap across, but the upscaling of the airborne operations was massive, wasn't it? As you said there, North Africa, there'd been quite a lot going on, but the expectations of the limited airborne ops in North Africa to what was expected of Husky, it's a massive, massive, great upward climb. And I think that kind of gets forgotten that there, as you said there's a shortage of gliders, there's a shortage of aircraft, there's a shortage of people, and a lack of training. And just we understand that obviously a lot of the airborne operations went badly wrong in Sicily, but I think understanding why they went wrong, and we'll have you back on in July to go through it in full detail there as part of the whole Operation Husky set of programming. But it is important to remind ourselves that the airborne ops just the scale increased massively, and with it the potential of things going wrong.
Exactly, and a perfect data point. At this time, British glider doctrine did not involve night flying or night landings. It was daylight operations. Monty wanted the mission to go at night. So think about the position he put his airborne commanders in, Lieutenant Colonel Chatterton and his 1st Air Landing Brigade. The British glider pilots had to take a crash course to learn to fly the American Waco. Then they had to learn to night fly it. and then they had to land at night in Sicily. The American troop carrier pilots had to go find a release point over water at night. Think about that, the difficulty in that. They weren't trained how to do that, and the release point was over water. What a foolish thing to do, offshore even. And then throw some bad luck in there. 30-mile-an-hour winds, headwinds, a headwind component against the gliders trying to land. So they were just a lot of things went wrong. But I'm just going to mention a couple things that went wrong in Husky. The American glider pilots, glider troop carrier pilots missed the release points. They couldn't find a release point. They released too far offshore. They experienced searchlights, anti-aircraft fire for the first time, many of these pilots, while towing a glider. The winds were against them. The release altitude was probably computed too low. I'll make that point too. Just a lot of things went wrong. Sadly, about 69 gliders of the 144 landed in the sea. About 326 British airborne troopers were lost and drowned. Glider pilots, including 6 American glider pilots, were killed in this operation. The British were short 26 glider pilots, so the 26 Americans flew on this mission. Not many folks know about that. But let's just not talk about the glider mission, but Operation Husky, other things went wrong. Talk about joint mission coordination. Guess what? The U.S. Navy shot down more C-47s than the Germans did in Italian anti-aircraft fire. 23 C-47s were shot with paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne down. That was horrendous. The Royal Navy shot down and forced down 6 C-47s on Fustian, the next mission I'm going to talk about here. We talked about the things going wrong. These TTPs were learned in blood here, and a lot of things. The good news is all these points, all these things that went wrong were studied in after-action reports. Lessons learned that they took seriously. Everything that we used, and all these corrections were made later, as we saw in Normandy. Okay. Here's a picture of a Waco glider. This one actually was released close to shore, actually floated to shore. These guys were probably lucky. They probably made it. But most of the glider pilots the gliders were released too far offshore. Some of them were picked up by British warships. Some of them drowned. It was just really sad. The airborne piece of Sicily was such a disaster, they had to keep this secret from the American public for a year. It was that bad. The things that went, especially the U.S. Navy shooting down 23 C-47s. You can correct me if I'm saying this pronounced. Fustian? How do you say that? How would you say that?
Fustian. I don't know. Everyone will say it differently. Who cares? It's just you say it your way, I say it my way, and people watching will say it their way.
Fustian was a follow-on para-glider resupply mission in the British sector that the U.S. troop carriers flew. But what was interesting, after Ladbroke that went so bad, the British glider pilots refused to be towed by an American C-47. So all your glider portion of this mission, they were towed by your RAF 38 wing bombers. The 60th and 62nd troop carrier, they carried paras of the British 1st Airborne Division. This mission was deadly. This one, more aircraft were shot down by the enemy. This was a deadly mission for the American troop carrier groups. The 60th lost 9 C-47s shot down alone on this mission. So really, really deadly follow-on mission. Obviously, once we captured Sicily, your troop carrier groups and gliders were forward staged to Sicily for the invasion of Italy. So that came next. Troop carriers obviously played a big part trying to save the beachhead at Anzio, and there's some paras loading up for the invasion of Italy. One other thing I'll mention, what Italy did, here's another first in innovation. In Sicily, the paradrops were so widely scattered, the decision to come up with what they call Pathfinder, the Pathfinder mission, was incorporated as one of the fixes for the disaster after Sicily. For Italy, the Pathfinders were used for the first time. So special troop carrier C-47s loaded with specially qualified Pathfinders to jump prior to the main para force to light up and identify the drop zone via electronic fires were used very successfully in Italy. So this was a huge plus that came out of one of those lessons learned that obviously were used in other back in the ETO. But because of this, 2,000 paras of the 82nd were dropped within hundreds of yards of the drop zone in Italy, so much more accurate than what happened in Sicily because of the use of Pathfinder. So I mentioned the aeromedical evacuation mission throughout the Italian campaign. The C-47s were used extensively again for the medical evacuation. Some more great original photos here found in the National Archives of medical evacuation missions going on in Sicily there. Finally, this is actually one of my favorite subjects here. Most people aren't familiar with. Once the Allies took control of the southern part of Italy, troop carrier groups were forward stationed into Brindisi, where the 60th was, and around Rome. The Secret War in the Balkans, RAF 334 Wing was at Brindisi, and they were actually controlled all the missions that went into Yugoslavia for supporting the British, the SOE and the American OSS, all the special operations missions. People don't understand the importance of this war. 20 Nazi divisions were tied up in Yugoslavia by partisans. And what that did is that kept those 20 divisions out of mainstream, out of Europe, out of the fight in Italy, supporting there. So it was, Yugoslavia was a mess. There's a civil war going on in Yugoslavia. They were fighting each other. Both sides were fighting the Nazis. And here we had to, the American, the British, had to try to support the folk, both sides initially, that were fighting the Nazis and try to tap dance that line right there. The 60th Troop Carrier Group from March to October 1944, the entire group was, they actually fell under RAF 334 Wing there in Brindisi, and they were totally committed to flying secret special ops missions in the Balkans, into Yugoslavia. This was a great part of the war, a great mission that most people don't know about. They resupplied Tito's partisans there. They evacuated wounded. And a very neat story, they evacuated over 500 downed Allied airmen that had flown bombers, mainly out of Italy, bombing into Hungary and Poland, that were shot down. The crews bailed out, escaped. They made their way to Yugoslavia. The partisans protected them. And we actually landed C-47s behind Nazi lines there to evacuate some of these pilots and crew members. Operation Halyard was the name of that mission. Fantastic story, fantastic mission, worthy of an episode in itself. Over 500 Allied airmen were rescued. So all part of the Secret War in the Balkans. C-47s played a huge role in that mission. Hey, finally, let's the invasion of Greece. Operation Manna, another operation folks aren't familiar with. The British 2nd Independent Airborne Battalion Brigade and teamed up with the U.S. 51st Troop Carrier Wing. It was another paradrop, a glider tow, combined operation mission there into Greece. They were airdropped there into an airfield there. And then they marched on to Athens and liberated Athens. So another way here that the C-47s supported and troop carrier and gliders supported the invasion of Greece, Operation Manna. I know I'm just kind of broad brushing over this, but I'm trying to cover everything today, what I call the MTO, the Mediterranean Theater of Ops, that most people aren't familiar with. It gives a great baseline of knowledge, hopefully, and sets the stages for the other major airborne operations later. Much of what I talked about today was actually in my latest book. This was my 3rd book I've published. It's called Leading the Way to Victory. It's a history of the 60th Troop Carrier Group, and it came out in January of this year. It's in worldwide distribution all over, easy to find. But much of what I talked about today was in that book, and there's an entire chapter on the Secret War in the Balkans, about 100 pages long in itself. And to me, that was the funnest thing for me, the most rewarding part of researching and writing this book, was learning how much I learned about Yugoslavia and the Balkans and Greece operations, and to pass that on. But this is my passion. I'm a C-130 guy, so the C-47 was the grandfather of the C-130. And so why am I at squadron reunions in my career? I met many C-47 pilots. I listened to their stories. They're all gone now. So I'm taking on my mission in life now is to tell the stories of the C-47 pilots and the glider pilots. It's an untold story. They don't get the coverage the bomber pilots, the fighter pilots got. So that's what that's why I'm here. And I think that's my last slide. So we'll call it mission complete. Ready for questions.
Yeah, and thank you for doing a fantastic presentation. As we said, we can have you come back and do some deeper dives on this later on. And folks, there are book links and links to Mark's website where you can find all his books, and that's in the description below. So let's talk about the learning curve, because it came up several times during this discussion, because all what you said is very interesting if we end it at the Mediterranean Theatre of Operations. But what is cool about this, as you said earlier, I want you to elaborate on this, is the lessons learned from this, because I don't just mean individual pilots saying do this, don't do this. I mean actual studies being done by people that can make a difference, so that when the next airborne operations are mounted, they can overcome some of this. You talked about the first use of Pathfinders, things like that. So what are your key takeaways of the things that are taken forward from the Mediterranean theatre? Because one of the things that I'll let you answer that, but I wanted to make the point that one thing I've learned hosting this channel, when you look at airborne operations globally in World War II, at least as many don't go as well as go well. I think we've got this not false understanding, but it's like gambling, isn't it? You remember your wins, you forget your losses. And I think people who love the concept of airborne warfare, they think about Normandy, they think about things like, maybe crossing of the Rhine. They don't think about some of the Russian or Soviet aborted operations. They don't think about some of the Germans into Crete. So address the fact first that airborne operations don't always go well, and then secondly, what did we learn from the Mediterranean?
Sure. Well, think about it. The airborne mission in itself is a high risk mission.
Yeah.
Those troop carrier gliders, you're flying low, slow over enemy territory to begin with. It's just it's high risk. There's so many unknowns. Your planning, usually a lot of times your planning was done on a short string and wasn't done well enough. We talked about those. That's the one thing, huge takeaway I could say is from Sicily invasion was the planning, the coordination between the Army and the Navy, alone. The U.S. Navy shooting down those aircraft. And guess what? Those invasion stripes painted on those aircraft for Normandy were a direct result of that lesson learned in Sicily. Right there's one lesson. Never again did you see a release point for gliders over water at night. The troops pilots aren't trained to judge distance at night in dark while you're getting shot at off shorelines. There's no navigation, wasn't advanced enough at this time. So the huge points were learned. If you also look at later on, like for Normandy, speak about navigation, they put homing beacons on ships in the channel, to help the troop carrier, the SkyTrain flow across, to help with their navigation. There's just so many lessons learned. Just coordination between forces, in daylight. Here's probably the biggest thing. Think about this. After Normandy and after Sicily, airborne ops went to daylight ops. That's the biggest change right there. Holland, think about it. All your airborne missions were done in daytime. The Rhine crossing, they were done in daytime because to minimize those navigation errors, to minimize those missing the drop zone, getting spread all over. The airborne mission, you have to have a compact land. Those forces need to land compact so they can form up, organize to fight. If they're spread out all over hell's creation, they just can't accomplish their mission. So the daylight ops really helped that. And if you look at market, the accuracy of the airborne drops was incredible because of the tight formations and the tight concentration of troops during the day. So lots of huge things. The C-47 didn't have self-sealing gas tanks. That came out of Sicily. So many lessons learned. The airborne mission is risky, but it continues on today because the good news is the Allies took these lessons to heart. And that's the good news of the disaster in Sicily. Yeah,
and that's where, I've just conducted a week-long tour, and I said to my guests, sometimes you have to wear your analytical hat, and sometimes you have to take it off and put your emotional hat on. And there's two ways of looking at Husky. On an emotional level, yes, lots of loss of life, lots of tragedy, lots of disasters that resulted in, as I said, that families grieving for their loved ones. But The analytical hat is that maybe they needed something to go a bit wrong to learn from it for the big game, because Husky was. People are still debating whether or not Husky in Sicily was even necessary. Could we have just skipped Sicily and gone to Italy? The point is, there will need to be a second front, and that second front is probably going to be in France. And so the big game, the cup final, to use an English slang, is going to be the invasion of France in 1944. And to make sure that cup final is a success, you need to make sure your airborne operations go very well. So probably it could be argued that the mixed bag of Sicily and Husky was directly to connect to the successes of Normandy, and those lives lost, were not necessary, but it was not worth it. It's never worth it, but it's part of the learning game, and it was good to have an experience that told the Allies that airborne operations can be high risk.
Yeah, one final point. There were those, talking about the emotional aspect, there were those who wanted Eisenhower to just get rid of airborne missions, after Sicily. And I had to wrestle with that decision. But in the end, as we know, he decided, no, this is a valuable part of our, operations. We need to have this capability. And if we take it to task to fix some of these things that went wrong, this is quite a capability, strategic capability that can be exercised. And he was right.
We have a couple of questions. So Bruce Day is asking, have you been to San Marcos, Texas to see the lead transport, that's all brother from the lead transport group the night of June the 5th? I'm assuming you have.
Yeah, that's 20 minutes from my house. Now that I'm fully retired, I actually hope to get involved with that organization. It's a beautiful aircraft. It flew the lead serial, obviously, but it's a beautiful restored aircraft. And yes, I have. Thank you.
Brilliant. So we're having other questions about, we talked about the C-47, but people are asking about the C-54s and C-46s. So were either of those aircraft used in the Mediterranean?
No, they came. The C-47, the C-46 came later. They came later, over 44 over to the UK. The C-54 was never really used. It was used in the Pacific extensively. I have not found a case of the C-54 being utilized by Troop Carrier Command, maybe Air Transport Command. I bet they probably used them, but not Troop Carrier Command did not use either in the Mediterranean.
Okay, and I'll wait for some more questions from the viewers, but you, as a C-130 guy, I mean, again, I'm going to bring it back to what I was saying about the fact that you said it yourself. The C-47 was the granddad. They're using equipment that is not designed for purpose, and yet when I look at the C-130, I can see the direct lineage to the C-47. It's bigger, it's got a greater capacity, but you can see when I watch the commemorative jumps over Normandy and that happened, you can see that things, although they've changed, they haven't changed too much in some ways. There's a direct correlation there. So what to bring things up to date, when you joined and were starting with troop carrier, what were the big change? What was exactly the same from World War II, and what were the things that were completely revolutionary?
Yeah. So I was commissioned in 1982. And by the way, I spent a lot of time in the UK in my C-130 career in the 1980s. I was able to fly at RAF Lynham with 47 and 70 Squadron, so great memories there. But it's interesting, things that were the same. Think about it. 1982, there was no GPS, right? There was the C-1. There was no. The C-130 still had a sextant in them, so celestial navigation.
Okay, yeah.
Goes back to World War II. Was still taught. It was exercised regularly. Just your basic steam gauges in the cockpit. You didn't have what's it called, flat screen dials. Everything was what we call a steam gauge. Those gauges were the same as World War II aircraft. A lot of it was the same. The technology, the mission was almost incredibly the same. Airborne paratroop drop. The big thing that changed was obviously the C-130s. And by the way, what replaced the glider on the battlefield was two things: the helicopter and the advent of what I call clamshell doors on the back of a transport aircraft that could airdrop heavy equipment out the back, like a Jeep or an artillery piece or a small tank. Those are the things, because what the glider solved was a problem that VEX commanders was able to resupply heavy equipment rapidly to a point on the battlefield in space. But airdrop, what's changed now is airdrop accuracy and the components that go into that airdrop mission. So that was a huge change. But the C-130 parachute missions, heavy equipment supply drops, and aeromedical evacuation missions. We still rig up the litter stanchions, just like you saw in that photo today in the back of the C-130. So all these missions continue today in tactical aircraft.
Right, so great question from Darren Little, who we have to thank for putting you in touch with me and you being on the show there. But Darren is asking, making a good point, which you've touched on, but I'd like to elaborate now, is the cooperation between the Americans and the British. Because again, as a Normandy guy, by the time we get to the Normandy jump, and indeed Market Garden and the Rhine, there's a clear, distinct separation between what the Brits are doing and Canadians and what the Americans are doing. The troop carriers are different, the aircraft, everything is different. But in North Africa, and this applies to pretty much everything in North Africa, that everybody's piled in together, and not just the British and American. You've got all the troops from other parts of the dominions as well. So how important do you think that aspect was? Is this the British and Americans, all these various forces learning from each other, because they've got different experience in counting slightly different things. Was that key to building a success for the future?
Yeah, and I'll get right to Darren. By the way, hey, Darren, thanks for having me, working this for me. But let's talk about RAF 334 wing at Brindisi there. So here you are, an American troop carrier group, basically on loan to an RAF wing for mission tasking. It was the RAF wing based on information they were fed from their special operators on the ground. So here you have that joint intelligence sharing right there for those mission tasking functions. That's where his relatives 267 squadron was there, the Pegasus squadron. They were at Brindisi also, but they shared intelligence resources. The folks who did all their packing for their supply drops, they were all the same people there. It was sharing resources. Talk about TTPs, things that went well, things that didn't go well. Those type of after action reports were shared there amongst the wing there at that same assigned to the same wing. So it was a great example of how a coalition force can work, in a coalition environment there.
Yeah, brilliant. And Bob is asking, and we can maybe expand on this, about the para racks for dropping equipment, because when you're talking about Yugoslavia, for example, there are lots of different ways in which C-47s can get supplies from landing and actually physically unloading. I'm thinking about the show I did about the Stalingrad airlift with Robert Forsyth a few weeks ago. From parachuting to dropping bundles. So do you want to run us through the kind of innovations that were happening in Mediterranean? How many different types of way were there for getting equipment from one place to another using troop carrier?
Yeah, the troop carrier options for dropping equipment were basically two options. You literally just push the bundle out the parachute door. You're just pushing it out the door. Or as the gentleman mentioned, the parapacks underneath. And depending on what other equipment the aircraft had on the bottom, whether it had that advanced radar, which came later, the SCR 717 radar, dictated how many of these para racks they could bolt on the bottom of the C-47, but anywhere from 2 to 6. And basically the para rack these bundles that they built, supply bundles, were just, they were wired up, strung up underneath these racks underneath the bottom of the aircraft. And you can think about it, it's just like pickling off a bomb. There's an electronic switch in the cockpit that basically released these packs that were bolted to the bottom of the aircraft. The packs were strung to these, and when that electronic pilot would hit that switch, it would release those bundles, and they would just fall down with canister, either in canisters or just built up in canvas bundles, depending on the type of load they were building with parachutes attached to them. So very innovative, and I'm trying to think, that was in the Mediterranean where those came around being also.
Okay, so we've got a couple more questions. It says it's Katie Way, but I'm assuming that's Greg Way, who's on later in the week talking about German gliders. Did US practice paradrops from glider tow trains, i.e. from tow aircraft and gliders simultaneously?
This is there were a couple of practices. I actually found evidence, but never in combat, because we'll think about this because of the weight, the power of that C4. If you got 14 to 18 paratroopers loaded in the back of a C-47, you're towing a glider with another 13 paras in there or some equipment. It gets to be too heavy for the aircraft. Right. They actually tried it though. There was actually an exercise in Sicily on October 25th, 1943. I just found out researching records where they actually tried it. and just the range, they couldn't go far because of the weight involved, and it didn't go well. So it was exercised, but it was never fully used. I never saw use of it in combat. I couldn't find any.
Okay, thank you for that. And Trent Telenko, one of our resident radar experts, is asking you to comment on the troop carrier Pathfinder operations in Operation Dragoon Anvil compared to North African Sicily. The Dragoon operation seemed a lot higher tech with radar beacons.
I don't have a great answer, but I can tell you this: the Eureka Rebecca systems that your Pathfinders used, okay, people don't. The first use of this was actually an Operation Torch. It didn't work well. It didn't. They actually had a fellow on the ground, a secret agent, with the Eureka system that he set up. Obviously, it didn't go well. He had to abandon his position before the troop carriers came in because of the delay from the peace to the war plan. But that technology, as far as I know, even from North Africa to the Pathfinder use in Italy by Salerno and D-Day, that Eureka Rebecca system was the same electronic beacons that the aircraft and the Pathfinders used. That didn't advance any, so the technology was the same. They had G later on. They had the G navigation systems, also G radio systems, kind of like a Loran long-range navigation system. They had that in Normandy. I'm not sure if they had it I guess they had it probably for Dragoon also, because it was about the same point in time. But so that was an advancement technology-wise. There was no G involved in the Mediterranean at all that I could find, those radio beacons. So that's probably one advancement. Other than that, I really don't know, to be honest with you.
Okay, well, we'll have one last question, and it's my question now to end things up, and it's kind of the kind of fun one in a sense, is that, clearly you are passionate about this whole subject. This is your background, both as a professional when you were flying, and now as a historian. Now you're not flying, or at least not flying in professionally. What are the things when you when someone sends you a link to an article about Troop Carrier Command, or you pick up a new book about Sicily or D-Day, whatever? What are the things that the bingo card of myths that you look for and you go, here we go again? What are the things that you see and you roll your eyes and you go, no, not that old chestnut again? Because there must be some things.
Probably the biggest thing I always look for, it's after Ladbroke, you think about it, the blame game, the Americans and the British pointing their fingers at each other, some myths, some truths on that. It was just, I'll just tell you, the American troop carrier pilots were not trained to release over water at night. That was probably the biggest thing they could have done wrong, was pick that release point. And by the way, the release point for Ladbroke was about a little over 3,000 yards offshore. So that's a little over a mile offshore to begin with. So the gliders, that's a mile over water. And then with that 30-knot headwind that, coming out of the west, they had to go into, and then there was no room for error there. There was flaws built in the plan. They didn't release them high enough to begin with. So just the release altitude, the release point, and all that, I really focus on that a lot. And Ian Murray there, I tell you, and is a fantastic source for glider ops and Ladbroke especially. He is a very knowledgeable gentleman on this subject. Other myths I look for, the one gentleman asked a question about paratroopers and gliders going out at the same time. That just didn't happen. They tried it in some training exercises. It just never happened.
And I guess the other thing, we've said it already, is just the fact that not enough people involved in the flying were ever interviewed when they were around. People relied on what paratroopers said. They relied on perhaps commanders who didn't know the intricacies said, and therefore allowed these ideas that are not necessarily false, but they are the opinions of people who have one particular view of this, not the wide range we really understand. And I would always tell, I would have airborne veterans on my tours in Normandy, and they would say, the bloody pilots. I would go, do you know what problems they faced? And I would just list through the things, and they go, oh yeah, no, I didn't know that. They always would see it from their point of view, and I think that's the danger we all face of interviewing people who are the sexy people. We speak to two, you know, we focus on what Rangers said and Commandos said and paratroopers said and fighter pilots, and we don't look at the wide-ranging sources there are out there to give these alternative views.
Yeah, one last comment on that I just thought of too is D-Day. You know, at this time, paratroop operation drops. It was a visual procedure. The pilots' crews had to see the ground, the drop zone. They had to see it. If there was a cloud bank or fog, the fog was the biggest thing that broke up the D-Day formations, the low ground fog that wasn't briefed, you know, that they flew into. And of course, there was radio silence. So their first aircraft that flew into it couldn't let the ones behind them know that was going on, you know, to look out for it. Yeah. So it was a visual procedure. Airdrop was a visual procedure at that time. Huge advancement from today now is the technology we have. You know, you can even drop pairs without seeing the ground and be very accurate.
Brilliant. Well, we will end things there because I've been looking at my data over the last few weeks, and slightly shorter shows do seem to pick up more traction after. So I'm trying to keep my shows to just over an hour in length, folks. Don't forget, this is only the first of 5 shows this week in gliders and troop carrier weeks. So we've got shows with Greg Way and Kevin Getz tomorrow. So lots more stuff coming your way. And Mark, I can promise you will be coming back because people have loved what you've said. I've loved your passion for this and your knowledge. So you'll be coming back. Did you enjoy talking to World War II TV this Easter Monday?
Oh, thrilled to be here. I really appreciate this. Thanks so much for having me.
Brilliant. So, folks, again, I remind you, the link to Mark's website is in the description below, where you can find all his various books and articles listed, more about his career, and there are other links to the books in the description below. So, Mark, thank you very much. This is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV, saying I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Cheers, Paul.
Bye.